In January 1943, the Eastern Front resembled a breathing organism, advancing by day, contracting by night. Rail lines twisted through frozen emptiness, and staff officers traced new front lines on maps already obsolete. Among the many fragments preserved in divisional archives, one small file concerns the 228th Rifle Battalion, a composite unit of Soviet infantry ordered to hold a supply corridor during the chaotic winter retreat. Its presence is confirmed in 3 surviving dispatches and a ration return. Then the record ends. What happened in that corridor has never been fully explained. The battalion had been reformed only a month earlier. It drew men from different regiments, veterans, replacements, a handful of technical specialists. Its equipment was ordinary. 3 rifle companies, a signals detachment, and a medical orderly borrowed from regimental headquarters. No tanks, no artillery. They were to hold a narrow strip of birch forest until relief arrived from the east. In principle, it was a simple mission: guard the line of telegraph poles that marked the only road through the marshes. The orders were issued from a small command tent pitched on frozen soil. Captain Anton Morozov signed for them at 18:10 hours. The document, faded carbon copy preserved in regimental files, reads in part, "Hold corridor until code word dawn. Maintain radio check each hour. On order, withdraw along bearing 92 degrees to secondary line." The handwriting in the margin, perhaps the adjutant's, adds, "Fog expected after 2100 hours." Morozov's adjutant, Lieutenant Sergei Volkov, later described the captain as quiet and methodical. He did not raise his voice even when the signals equipment failed. The battalion's political officer, Senior Lieutenant Petrov, was younger, more talkative, forever polishing his pistol grip. These men, Morozov, Volkov, Petrov, will appear again in our reconstruction. They are the thread that ties scattered witness accounts together. By 1900, the companies moved out in single file along the frozen track. Sentries reported visibility at 50 meters and falling. At 2000, first radio check, all positions secure. At 2100, the fog thickened. One operator noted that the antenna wire glittered with rime like strings of glass. At 2200 hours, static swallowed the 3rd Company's call sign. Morozov instructed his runner to verify in person. That runner's name, Private Artem Kravchenko, appears once in the file marked Dispatched 2215. There is no note of his return. The 2240 entry in the signal log is an indentation without words, a hand pressing the paper, waiting for a voice that never came. At 2300 hours, only broken fragments answered. The last clear phrase transmitted from the 228th frequency was a single word, "Hold," and then the net dissolved into static. Later, engineers would argue about the cause: ionized air, battery freeze, antenna icing. None explained why the equipment, recovered days later, remained in perfect working order. At 4 a.m. the following morning, a relief patrol from the parent regiment reached the corridor's edge. Fog still blanketed the ground. Their boots sank into powder that erased its own prints. They found braziers warm but unattended, rifles leaning in stacks, bread frozen solid beside unopened tins of soup. No bodies, no struggle. The patrol commander's brief note in the Daily Situation Journal reads, "Position unoccupied, no contact." That phrasing, flat procedural, marks the first official acknowledgement that the 228th had vanished. They called out by regulation, 3 whistle blasts, Pause. 3 again. Only the echo returned. The patrol leader ordered a perimeter sweep. His men looped ropes around their waists to avoid separation. When they regrouped 10 minutes later, each reported the same thing. No tracks leading away, no sign of enemy approach. The scene was so intact that one soldier hesitated to enter, fearing the owners might simply step from the fog to reclaim their posts. By midday, the fog lifted. The battalion was gone. Equipment remained cataloged, positions undisturbed, the small flag marking headquarters still frozen upright. What began as a routine relief became a report labeled Incident Number 47B. From this point onward, the historian's task is not to invent, but to follow the language of these papers, the clipped certainty of officers trying to describe what they did not understand. At first light, the regiment widened the search. 6 soldiers, roped together, stepped into the mist and counted each pole aloud, so they would not lose rhythm. Every 10th marker they tied with linen cloth, each flag folding in slow motion as frost stiffened it. They spoke little. Their boots sank to the same depth as the prints around the abandoned fires. The fog dampened even breathing. By 700 hours, the patrol reported the corridor cleared from end to end. They listed what they found: stacked rifles, rations unopened, telephone wire coiled neatly beside the road. No cartridge cases, no shell bursts, no footprints beyond their own. The officer in charge wrote the phrase, "Position unoccupied, equipment in order." On the page it looks routine, but every man in the column felt the wrongness of such stillness. Back in the field tent, Captain Anton Morozov of the 228th Rifle Battalion and his adjutant, Lieutenant Sergei Volkov, stood over the map with the regimental staff. Senior Lieutenant Petrov, the political officer, hovered beside them, taking notes by lantern light. They decided to follow the planned withdrawal bearing, 92 degrees east by south, to test if fog alone could mislead a company. A platoon volunteered for the run. The platoon departed at 800 hours and reached the first stream within 30 minutes. Ice cracked softly under their boots. Beyond it, the forest thickened. They pressed another 100 meters and halted. Branches were unbroken, snow crust untouched. On the return march, the platoon leader noted his compass needle drifting, settling, drifting again. He tapped the glass, marked the hesitation, and moved on. His report ends. Direction confirmed. Terrain ordinary. That ordinary word would echo through every statement that followed. By midday, the regiment formalized the incident as Case 47B and extended searches north and south of the corridor. The weather brightened for an hour, revealing a landscape blank as paper, no smoke columns, no distant movement. When the fog rolled back in, it erased even the searchers' own footprints, leaving them uncertain whether they had walked that ground at all. At 1500 hours, Volkov compiled his summary. Position found unoccupied at 6:20, no enemy sign. Probable. Premature withdrawal in fog. Petrov added beneath it, ensure men take hot rations. 2 lines on a page, one analytical, one human. Neither would be enough to explain 400 missing names. That evening, the regimental major convened a formal review. The fog outside pressed against the canvas like breath. He summarized the situation in clipped phrases. No contact, no evidence of engagement, radios intact, men absent. He ordered search pattern Arc 2 for first light, 2 companies to sweep in widening semicircles, engineers to test compasses, signalmen to monitor the battalion frequency at every hour and half hour. Morozov listened, hands clasped behind his back. When asked if any company could have misunderstood the withdrawal signal, he shook his head once. "Dawn," he said, "has only one meaning." Volkov suggested the possibility of an alternate order issued by telephone. The major made a note. Verify secondary channel. Petrov reported that the men in camp remained calm, though they spoke of the corridor in lowered voices. At 21:40, the signal operator seated by the set at the rear of the tent lifted his pencil. A faint carrier wave had appeared on the 228th frequency, 10 seconds long, then silence. The officers waited. No voice followed. The major ordered the time logged and the frequency kept open. They heard only the tent fabric sigh and the steady hiss of the lamp. In the transcript, the entry reads, "Carrier detected. Source undetermined." Outside, frost formed along the ropes and metal buckles. The telegraph line beside the camp gleamed white against a sky without stars. Morozov and Volkov stepped out briefly, staring toward the invisible corridor. "Tomorrow," Volkov said, "we will find them." Morozov did not answer. When he finally turned back toward the tent, his breath fogged the lantern glass and hid his reflection. The log for midnight closes with the same words as the one before it. 00, no traffic. A small dot after the last zero, a clerk's habit to end an hour like a sentence. The historian reading that line decades later sees not a report, but a pause, the weight of a moment recorded only by silence. At first light, the fog returned exactly as forecast, a gray tide rolling between the trunks. The new sweep, Arc 2, began at 0500. Each man carried a rope length tied to his belt. Each 10th marker received a cloth tag numbered in pencil. The engineer at point used 2 compasses, military and civilian, to test deviation. Every few minutes he paused, tapped the glass, and whispered the bearing aloud for the clerk to repeat. By 600 hours they reached the second stream, the one the test platoon had reported the previous day. The ice was darker now, thawing faintly from an overnight rise in temperature. Someone remarked that the air smelled metallic, like a tool left out in rain. It was the only description that day not written in military language. A few meters beyond the stream lay the remains of a small bivouac, 2 ground sheets, a half-filled lamp oil tin, and footprints circling once before fading into unbroken crust. The officer marking the find drew a ring on his map and labeled it Point 17. The objects were collected and photographed, their arrangement precise. To modern eyes the scene looked staged, but that precision was the habit of men trained to account for everything, even what they did not understand. Back at headquarters, the signals log continued its quiet discipline. At 700 hours, no contact. 7:30, carrier wave again, 10 seconds. 800, nothing. The repetition of these empty phrases gives the historian a sense of rhythm. The war as a metronome of silence and attempt. To those in the tent, it was only routine, but routine can become superstition. One operator began crossing himself before each call. Another tapped the desk twice with his pencil, a pattern he could not later explain. By mid-morning, the engineers returned. Their compasses agreed within 1 degree, no anomaly found. The civilian lensatic set, however, showed a brief swing east when held at chest height. They attributed it to a metal button or belt buckle, but wrote it down nonetheless. In the archive, that note survives as deviation 3 degrees east, cause unknown. Such small uncertainties accumulate like snow, layering a mystery with the weight of its own documentation. At 1100 hours, the fog thinned enough for aerial reconnaissance from a liaison aircraft. The pilot reported no movement in the sector, only an uneven pattern of footprints converging near the telegraph line, then vanishing within 50 meters. He circled twice, took 2 photographs, and turned back before the cloud ceiling closed. Those images, grainy, indistinct, remained the only visual record of the second day. That evening the major studied the prints under a magnifier. He traced one set with a finger. "Relief patrol," he said, though he could not prove it. Morozov leaned closer. "Our men would have walked 2 abreast," he murmured. "These are single file." No one argued. Petrov recorded the exchange word for word. The last line of his notebook reads, "Weather turning again." Men speak softly. Snow began just after 2100 hours. Thick flakes that softened every edge. The search parties returned in silence, faces gray with fatigue. Hot soup steamed from field pots. The air smelled briefly of smoke and cabbage. The major walked the perimeter once, noting how quickly the new snow-covered footprints. Within an hour, the ground looked untouched. At 22:40, a single pulse struck the radio net. 3 seconds this time, shorter than before. The operator wrote, "Carrier again, weaker." He did not call out. He simply marked the time and underlined it twice. When asked later why he had not reported immediately, he answered that the signal felt too close, as if it came from within the fog around the tent. The major dismissed the remark as fatigue. Inside, Morozov reviewed the day's maps. Every arc of search traced like ribs across the corridor, each labeled with a time that now meant nothing. He folded the chart carefully and slipped it into his coat. Volkov, standing nearby, said they would try the southern marsh in the morning. Petrov nodded, though his eyes were on the frost forming inside the tent seams. He wrote one final note before extinguishing the lamp. Compass test inconclusive. Morale steady. At midnight, the log closed again. 00, no traffic. Outside, the snow thickened, erasing the last of the day's paths. The historian reading this file finds the pattern familiar: search, record, silence, each repetition less about discovery than about confirming that the world remains empty where men once stood. By dawn on the third day, the corridor had become a diagram of human intention. Linen flags at every 10th pole, pencil circles on maps, arrows that insisted meaning could be found if only the geometry were correct. The regiment's Arc 3 sweep pushed south, where the birch belt thinned and the marsh widened. The order was careful and unadorned. Maintain line of sight. Call bearings every 100 steps. Note anything not explained by the previous day's patrols. Men repeated the rules softly to themselves, as if keeping time to a metronome only they could hear. Within the first hour, they reached a low rise marked on the sketch as dry ground, a rare firmness underfoot. There they found a bivouac no larger than a room, 2 ground sheets, a brazier ringed with stones, a tin of lamp oil half full, and a single wool cap pressed into the snow as if someone had set it down and forgotten to lift it again. Footprints ringed the place once and faded. The clerk labeled it .23 and photographed it with the unit's small camera. In the print, the stones looked like punctuation around a sentence no longer on the page. Beyond the rise, the marsh resumes, ice under a thin skin of snow that flexes with a hollow sound. The engineer at point paused and held up his notebook. The civilian compass, which had been steady the day before, drifted again and recovered. He made a small mark, deviation 2 degrees east, brief, and tapped the glass once, more habit than correction. He could not prove whether the instrument or the morning was at fault. He recorded it anyway. At 900 hours, the signal team at the corridor's northern end reported the faint carrier again. 5 seconds now. No voice. The regimental major, back at the tent, underlined the time and worked his jaw as if deciding whether to speak. He did not send a message. There was nothing to say. Morozov stood beside him with his cap in his hands, eyes on the map. Volkov kept count of the patrol's steps against the poles listed on the sketch. Petrov wrote, "Carrier persists. Men calm." Near midday, the line angled toward a stand of older trees where bark peeled in vertical slips. A set of objects lay in the snow at the base of one trunk, as if arranged. A pencil, a small pocket calendar open to January, and a spoon. The calendar bore 3 check marks beside dates corresponding to their first night in the corridor. There were no marks after the 22nd. The patrol leader placed the items in a cloth bag and drew a square around the tree on the map. He did not speculate aloud, and the men did not ask him to. Toward the end of the sweep, the snow began again. Slow, deliberate flakes that erased the rope line as it moved. The patrol called bearings, numbered the last linens, and returned along their own fading tracks. At camp, the engineer presented his compass notes with an apology. The figures were small and uncertain. The major nodded. In the ledger, small and uncertain is still a record. When the day closed, they had added 3 labeled points, 2 photographs, and a page of times synchronized with a signal that touched them like a cough through the walls of a neighboring room. The historian can say only this. On the 3rd day, the search found signs of pause, but no direction of departure, and a clock made of hours and static kept time with a unit that did not answer. By late afternoon, an inquiry officer from division arrived unannounced, a captain with a leather portfolio and a manner that made the tent feel smaller. His role was procedural, not punitive. Assemble the papers, align the times, and decide whether the incident ended here with a paragraph or continued as a file. He began not with questions, but with a ritual of order. He laid out the map, lined up the 2 aerial prints edge to edge, and placed the cloth bags containing the objects from point 17 and point 23 beside them, as if he were setting instruments on a tray. "Walk me through," he said. The major did, sparing adjectives. At each hour, the captain slid a finger along the corridor, tapped the linen markers on the sketch, and nodded as if marking the beat of a familiar song. He paused over the signal log. "The carrier repeats," he said. "Duration changes. Source unknown." He did not look at the radio operator when he spoke. He looked instead at the small dot after each hour that closed the entry. He seemed to approve of the dot. Morozov described the battalion's orders. Hold, report each hour. Withdraw on the code word at 1900 hours. Dawn, a word that in this winter meant signal rather than sun. He spoke the names of the company commanders with care, as if returning them to a room where no one else used them. Volkov added compass figures and the precise location of the 2 streams. Petrov, reading from his notes, recorded the mood as steady and the weather as a factor of first resort in every explanation. The captain opened the cloth bag marked point 23 and removed the pocket calendar, holding it by the corners. 3 dates bore check marks. "Routine," he said, Men carry their own calendars to reconcile ration days. He closed it and replaced it exactly as found, then lifted the pencil. It was sharpened evenly, the point intact. "Not dropped," he murmured. "Put down." The spoon he left in the bag. He examined the photographs next. The aerial prints showed 2 pale stitches where men had crossed the snow. The trail on the second print narrowed to a single thread and then vanished in glare. "Your relief patrol," the captain said, though there were other possibilities. He penciled a light question mark in the margin, then rubbed it out with a finger as if the paper itself should not remember indecision. He asked for the engineer's compass notes and read them without expression. 2 degrees east, he repeated, then smiled without humor. "Nature is not obliged to respect our instruments." He looked around the table. "But you wrote it down." "Good." He slid the notes under the portfolio clasp. At 1900 hours, the radio set on the back table gave a brief tremor of sound. The operator lifted a hand. The captain lowered his gaze to the log. 5 seconds. No voice. He did not bother to look at the tent walls or the faces of the men. "We will call that coincidence until we cannot," he said. The major wrote the sentence into the record, not as a conclusion, but as a method. When the talking was done, the captain summarized in the quiet voice of someone who has learned that an inventory can be a kind of consolation. No enemy contact, no signs of hasty departure, equipment in order, 3 minor points of interest, labeled and bagged, intermittent carrier at irregular intervals, probable, movement attempted in fog, possible, miscommunication of code word, possible, parallel orders not logged, unresolved. He capped his pencil and set it parallel to the map's edge. Outside, the snow had resumed, turning the camp's footprints into a shallow relief that would be gone by morning. The captain fastened his portfolio and asked to walk the first 100 meters of the corridor before dark. Morozov went with him, then Volkov, then Petrov, at a distance with the cloth bag of objects pressed against his coat. They halted at the first linen marker and stood as if they had reached a border no one could see. In the quieter air beyond the tents, the wires hummed faintly, a single line drawn through a page that could not be read to the end. Back at the table, the captain wrote a last line for the day's file. "Search to continue at first light. Maintain hourly watch. Treat carrier as artifact unless corroborated." It was a reasonable sentence that felt like a lid placed gently on a box. The men signed their initials in the margin, small proofs that they had stood in a room and watched the light diminish, while a corridor beyond the canvas continued to be exactly itself, straight, narrow, and, for now, entirely empty. The regiment established 2 listening posts at the ends of the corridor just before full dark, each with a field set, a wristwatch, and a simple instruction. If the carrier tone returned, mark the second, count to 10, and note the direction of strongest signal by turning the headset's frame like a crude loop antenna. The inquiry officer stood at the northern post with Morozov. At the southern, Volkov and the signal chief watched the dial and the face of the watch as if one could teach the other patience. At 21:19, the tone arrived. Short, thin, almost a question. Both posts marked the same second. The inquiry officer nodded and held up a finger. At 21:34, it came again, 5 seconds this time, enough for each post to turn in place by quarter steps. Their arrows on the map met not at the telegraph line or the stream, but in the corridor's middle distance, where nothing lay except snow, and the memory of stacked rifles. They waited. At 21:40, the tone returned, weaker, as if it had traveled farther to reach them, though nothing visible had changed. Only the fog drawing in threads between trees. The northern post recorded bearing 181, the southern bearing 002, numbers so clean they felt like a kindness from disorder. The operator at the southern post, a practical man, wrote likely allusion beside his own entry, as if not to burden whoever might read it later. At 2200 hours, snowfall began, broad, heavy flakes that softened the tent ropes and turned the linen markers pale. In that muffled air, a new sound entered the line, too soft to call a voice, but not the anonymous smoothness of carrier, more like a breath briefly dragging over the edge of a microphone. The inquiry officer leaned closer to the set and then straightened, as if refusing to acknowledge anything that could not be written into the template of a log. They returned to the tent with their numbers and laid them out. The captain drew a small circle with a steady hand and labeled it with a letter only he used, T. "Treat as artifact," he said. "We have a location, not a source." He wrote the sentence into the day's record verbatim. The major added, "No unusual atmospheric conditions reported sector-wide." Volkov, back from the southern post, shook snow from his shoulders and stood at the edge of the lamp's light, saying nothing. There was a comfort in procedure that night. The men tried it on like a coat. They poured tea that tasted of smoke and iron, compared watch faces, squared the corners of the aerial prints. When the lantern flickered, the inquiry officer shaded the chimney with his hand as if to protect the map beneath. Petrov, who had been precise all day, let his pencil rest on a line and listened without meaning to the tent canvas breathe. In his notebook, he wrote a sentence that does not appear in the official file. The corridor seems to listen back. At midnight, the set gave one last pulse, 2 seconds only, at a time that made no column a line. The operator wrote it anyway and underlined the hour. He set the pencil down with care, dot after the last zero, and closed the log. Outside, snow erased the rope paths as quickly as footsteps could make them. The camp settled into the kind of sleep that is not rest but deferral. They would try again at first light. They set off at 0600 into snow that remembered nothing. The plan was small on purpose. Carry the circle to the circle, not to prove anything, but to see what ground made of numbers drawn in a warm tent. Volkov kept the line straight by calling every 20 paces. Morozov repeated bearings, and the inquiry officer, whose handwriting had been exact in the tent, kept his pencil in his glove, writing less and seeing more. The land received them without reply. At the first stream, the ice gave a polite complaint under the point man's weight. Beyond, the birch trunks spaced wider, the fog, thinning and thickening in slow breath, admitted depth only in brief grants. A linen tag from the previous day, 17, hung like a small flag, frozen open. They paused there, not because the number meant anything beyond a place someone had chosen to mark, but because it felt like a place where the map and the ground shook hands. At the second rise, the line stalled. Ahead stood 2 trees tied with cord, stretched between them a strip of canvas on which someone had chalked the outline of a rectangle, as if rehearsing a tent's footprint. The canvas was dusted with snow. No prints approached or left. Volkov crouched and brushed the surface. Chalk smeared onto his glove like the remains of a note erased by weather. He placed the scrap in a bag and nodded for the line to proceed. Near the circle, they had labeled T. The ground changed tone. Snow over reed made a hushing sound underfoot. The point man raised a hand without knowing why, the gesture of somebody hearing their own breath louder than the world's. They stood in silence. The inquiry officer checked his watch and wrote the time. Morozov turned his head as if listening for a word he expected. They found nothing that could be called discovery, no cache, no hidden track, no foxhole glazed by thaw. Only the suggestion of a place recently used for not very long, shallow depressions that could have been wind, a circle of frostless snow the size of a helmet, a match head blackened and half swallowed by white. The captain lifted a glove to halt the line and then lowered it, the universal sign among men who know that not all pauses need names. The file received another page. The captain wrote in the manner of someone placing a lid neatly on nested boxes. Arc 3 completed. Objects bagged. No enemy evidence. Carrier detected at prior hours only. Ground search reached T. Negative findings. Probable. Misinterpreted code word or staggered withdrawal under fog, fragmentation of formation. Possible. Parallel verbal order unlogged. Unresolved. He paused over the last word, then drew a small line beneath it. Not an underline exactly, more a rest between notes. The major signed with a hand that left a faint shake in the ink. Volkov warmed the point of his pencil near the lamp and began copying bearings into a clean ledger. He had started a second volume to keep the numbers from running into each other. Petrov turned the pocket calendar from point 23 to the next month. February was empty. No check marks, no penciled notes, nothing to fit into any grid. Just before dusk, the set trembled again. Softer than the night before, a thread pulled through cloth. The operator did not look up this time. He simply marked the hour and closed his eyes as if matching breath to the hiss of the line. "We cannot chase a texture," the captain said, not unkindly. He placed his pencil parallel to the map's edge and stood. "Tomorrow we will end the field search and begin the paper one." Outside, the wind lifted a moment, combing the telegraph wires to a tone that made men glance at their watches. Snow slid from the tent's lee side in a sheet and landed without sound. The corridor waited, made of trees and air and weather, unchanged by their attention. In the file, the day ended with a list that looked like certainty and felt like snow, solid to the eye, empty to the touch. The morning opened with a decision. The field search would conclude after one last sweep, following the same bearing that had once marked the battalion's withdrawal route. The inquiry officer phrased it as a courtesy to procedure, to close the circle. In truth, it was an act of respect. 4 days of data had given them measurements, but no story. 4 days of silence had made the air itself part of the record. They stepped off at 0700. Morozov, Volkov, the captain, and 6 enlisted men formed the line. The engineer carried both compasses again. Petrov remained at headquarters to maintain the log. The fog this time was thinner, but steadier, as though content to exist rather than to move. Frost patterns traced ferns across the rifle stocks, each line delicate as handwriting. By 8:30, they reached the corridor's midpoint. Linen tags from the first day still clung to poles, numbers blurred by frost. A few hundred meters farther, they entered a depression where the snow crust shone differently, a dull luster as if ice lay just beneath. Volkov knelt and brushed the surface. The snow gave way to a thin film of water, then ice again. Beneath the glassy layer lay shapes that looked like air pockets, but were perhaps the imprints of objects removed. The captain photographed the area, marked it Field T1, and ordered them forward. At 900 hours, the compass needles began to drift. Both instruments moved in slow oscillation, returning to north only after long persuasion. The engineer tried to find metallic ore with his magnet rod. It sank easily, touched nothing. "Magnetic anomaly," he said, half to himself. The captain made a note. "Local deviation 10 to 15 degrees, cause undetermined." He did not write that the deviation matched the line of their own progress. That was interpretation, and interpretation had no column on the form. At headquarters, Petrov kept the hourly schedule. The carrier did not return. He filled each blank with the same phrase, "No traffic," until the page began to look like snow itself. Identical marks, differing only by time. At 10:30, the generator coughed, the lamp dimmed, and the static rose to a brief whisper that seemed to form a shape before collapsing. He wrote nothing. He simply checked his watch and drew a line under the hour. The historian, reading that line later, sees a man who believed order could be sustained by repetition, even when repetition was all that remained. By 1600 hours, the final sweep had reached the road. No tracks joined their own. No trace had appeared between the linen markers. The captain closed his notebook and said only, "That will do." He turned once to look back. The fog, catching evening light, appeared almost metallic, a surface rather than air. Morozov folded the map with care and placed it in the inner pocket of his coat. Volkov stopped counting. They returned to camp at 1700. The inquiry officer wrote his final field entry, "Search terminated. Negative result. Recommend closure and compilation." The major signed without comment. Petrov laid his notebook beside the others and began to pack the radio components into crates, each wrapped against frost. The sound of wooden lids sliding home echoed like punctuation marks across the snow. At 1900 hours, the time once set for the battalion's withdrawal, the operator idly turned the dial through the dead bands, a habit of farewell. For 3 seconds, a faint carrier tone answered, steady and clean. He stared at the needle, then at the clock, and let it pass. He did not write it down. Some silences deserved to remain whole. The report was assembled in orderly fashion. The captain dictated, the clerk typed, the pages were numbered in sequence. Investigation complete. 228th Rifle Battalion presumed lost between 2100 hours, 22nd January, and 0600 hours, 23rd January, 1943, Berezovaya Corridor Sector. No enemy action recorded in vicinity. Environmental factors, fog, navigation failure, probable contributors. No evidence of mutiny, desertion, or engagement. File to remain open pending further intelligence. End. He read it once, corrected nothing, and initialed each sheet. The file was sent to Division Archives, then copied to Army Group Headquarters. From there, it traveled with other papers in wooden crates to the east, to warehouses whose doors would close before spring. What survived of the battalion thereafter existed only in these pages. Numbers, bearings, fragments of procedural language that pretended to conclude a story still unwritten. By the thaw, nothing distinguished the corridor from any other strip of forest. The markers rotted, the ropes dissolved, the wind erased the neatness men had drawn into the land. The army moved on. The number 228 appeared once more in an administrative role marked to be reconstituted. It was, as armies do, reborn on paper. The place that had contained its absence remained unnamed. 2 decades later, the war's paperwork began to surface again, called back from warehouses where cold and bureaucracy had stored it. In one of those boxes, under requisition lists and meteorological reports, the file marked 47B reappeared. The cover was water-stained, but legible. The first page still carried the faint outline of a fingerprint where someone had closed it before the ink had dried. The clerk who logged the file into the new system made no note of its contents, only Miscellaneous Field Investigation, Winter, 1943. Yet within the folder, arranged with the neatness of habit, lay the entire account. The orders, the signal logs, the maps folded into thirds, the photographs of empty snow and numbered poles. Each page was stamped unresolved. When historians encountered the file in later years, they tried to match its dates against known operations. The Berezovaya corridor fit between 2 offensives, a blank strip of map used only for supply movement. Enemy forces were nowhere near it on those days. No intercepted transmissions, no captured prisoners, no sightings by aerial patrols. The 228th Rifle Battalion entered the corridor on the 22nd of January, 1943, and ceased to exist in the record at 22:40 that night. Everything that followed, the patrols, the inquiry, the reports, belonged to other people trying to describe that absence. The few surviving officers interviewed years later remembered little. Volkov spoke of fog so dense that the world reduced to a rope's length. Petrov, who later became a teacher, recalled the sound of the telegraph wires and wind, like music that will not stop. Of Morozov, there is no later mention. His name appears on no subsequent roster. The file, for all its pages, answers none of these details. Today, the Berezovaya corridor is a stretch of forest indistinguishable from any other. The telegraph line has long since fallen, the road reduced to a path followed by hunters and villagers. In spring, the ground softens and releases the frost's imprint. In winter, it hardens again, preserving nothing but its own silence. If you stand there at dawn, you can still hear the wind slip through the birches and perhaps imagine the rhythm of voices counting poles, the rope tightening between unseen men. The historian can offer only what remains measurable, coordinates, times, statements. Everything else is conjecture. But in that restraint lies the quiet weight of the record itself. The disappearance of the 228th Rifle Battalion is not a story of ghosts or revelation. It is the story of how absence becomes part of history, how the lines drawn to define understanding sometimes outline the shape of what cannot be known. The final note added to the file bears no signature. It reads, "Case retained for reference." No further action. The handwriting is firm but impersonal, the mark of someone finishing a duty rather than ending a mystery. And so the corridor remains, half map, half silence, its coordinates preserved by ink, its meaning left to those who still believe that every unanswered call on a forgotten frequency might, one day, receive an echo.